Good morning, it's Wednesday the 18th of March. I'm Maret Gwyn and you're watching Europe Today, your daily dose of European news and analysis live here from Brussels. Coming up, the war in the Middle East is reviving tensions within the NATO alliance. US President Donald Trump berated allies once again last night for refusing to help the US force the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, describing it as a, quote, foolish mistake. Leaders of several European nations have resisted pressure from the US to immediately send warships to the strait for fear of being dragged into the war, with the leaders of France, Germany, the UK, Greece and Poland publicly rejecting military involvement. Meanwhile, a senior US intelligence officer close to Trump has abruptly stepped down from his role as he urged the president to, quote, reverse course on Iran. For more on this, I'm joined in the studio this morning by our correspondent, Shauna Murray.
Morning,
Good morning. Great to have you again. Listen, we're seeing an increasingly frustrated President Trump. He's again berating his allies and also coming under pressure internally with a senior intelligence officer stepping down.
Well, let's look at the start of the week. He first said that NATO would have a very bad future if it doesn't support him in this war in the Gulf, in the Strait of Hormuz. And then yesterday he actually said that he doesn't need NATO anymore and that his request for support was in fact a test. Now let's take a listen to what he said this in the White House yesterday.
NATO's making a very foolish mistake, and I've long said that, I wonder whether or not NATO would ever be there for us. So this was a great test, because we don't need them, but they should have been there. And we as the United States have to remember that.
Well, that's a very important statement. I'll tell you why. Because the only time that Article 5 has ever been triggered with inside NATO was after 9/11. And NATO allies followed the United States to the war in Afghanistan. And allies like Denmark, for example, lost as many soldiers per capita as the United States. So it's factually incorrect to say that NATO wouldn't be there. And that is really going to draw the ire of NATO allies who have said that, look, we don't want to get involved in this war because NATO is a defensive alliance. We're there to protect each other within NATO territory as well. We also don't know the full definition of the war, what the objectives are as well. So we'll see what happens there. But as you mentioned as well, Mared, he is under pressure because Joe Kent, one of his top counter-terrorism guys within the administration, resigned on behalf of the fact that he said he doesn't want to go to war. And that is a very important resignation, not just because it's the first, but Joe Kent is MAGA through and through. So the question is this a harbinger for Trump?
And I know, Shauna, you spent quite some time at the NATO HQ here in Brussels. What are you hearing there about the reaction, how they're feeling about these threats coming from the White House?
Well, a few people have said this is just typical Trump NATO bashing. The other point, Nana, we heard this at the Arctic last week when I spoke to the German Defence Minister Boris Pistorius. They're very annoyed that Donald Trump has removed the oil sanctions against Russia, which means that Russia now has more money to spend on the war in Ukraine and more money to attack NATO allies. They're obviously not going to respond publicly in relation to this, but also there's a consensus that maybe he's not talking about NATO, maybe he's just talking about European allies. But other people have said to me that they're quite annoyed with Mark Rutte because he gave fulsome, full-throated support for this war. He went on Fox News on the 2nd of March saying that all European allies were fully behind Donald Trump. And perhaps Donald Trump then expected Europeans to get behind him. And in fact, they did the opposite. They rejected it. Other things that Europeans are saying to me is, look, we can't afford to get into a mission like this. It's drawing down assets from the Baltics, from the Arctic if we do. It's very expensive. What can we do? In fact, let's be realistic. And at the time when Donald Trump was calling for this support from the US, he wasn't sending any US Marines, and now he is. So the Europeans are kind of standing back saying there's not much we can do.
And very, very briefly, Shauna, this will come up when EU leaders gather here in Brussels tomorrow.
That's right. Big European Council meeting tomorrow. Wasn't expected to be on the table, but the main part of this discussion will also be the economic impact, the price of oil and so on of this war in Europe.
OK, and we will, of course, be following those discussions here in Brussels tomorrow. But now, moving on, civilians in the Middle East are being caught in the crossfire of the US and Israel's war against Iran, with strikes hitting homes, hospitals and schools. The UN says that the shockwaves of the war, including airspace closures and disruptions to trade and energy routes, are affecting its ability to respond. Euronews' Maeve McMahon sat down with United Nations Humanitarian Affairs Chief Tom Fletcher. She started by asking him whether the UN is being increasingly sidelined in a world where international law is in retreat.
This is a time of impunity and division and polarisation, and a lot of people are attacking the UN. But every time you hear someone attack the UN, ask yourself what they gain by making us weaker. Because actually, impunity, brutality, polarisation, war, we were built for times like this. This is why we were invented. And look, in the last week, I've lost 4 colleagues on the front lines who've given their lives to go out there and save lives because of the mess the world is in right now. So is the UN perfect? No way. But, you know, I'm not going to accept the attacks that come our way.
Will the UN still exist in 10 years?
Yeah, absolutely. Because we represent the imperfections of the world. It's a complicated, messy world. We wish we could do more, actually, to end these conflicts, to send out our peacekeepers and our peacemakers. We can only do that where we get a mandate from the world, from the member states. And right now, the member states are in this kind of transactional, muscular, geopolitical moment where they're pulling apart rather than pulling together. And we've got to be a force for coexistence and solidarity.
And just before the war began, President Trump inaugurated his so-called Board of Peace. Did he get bored of peace very soon?
Well, I mean, we look forward to hearing more from the Board of Peace about how they're ending a number of conflicts, apparently around the world right now. I'm dealing with the consequences of so many of those conflicts, whether it's in Sudan or South Sudan or the DRC or Gaza, or I say Lebanon, at this moment. The White House, when I talk to them, are very clear that the Board of Peace is not an alternative to the UN. And certainly the other countries that have joined it have been absolutely categoric that this is not meant to replace the UN. We're still here.
So you don't feel threatened by it? I
don't feel threatened by it. You know, we're a member state organisation of over 190 members. Of course, different groups of countries come together to try and talk about peace or other issues. There's enough conflict in the world right now. If people want to bring some peace, I'm completely relaxed about that.
How many people are internally displaced in Iran?
Hundreds of thousands, we estimate. What's interesting at the moment is that they're not crossing the borders at the scale that we expected. So you've got a lot of instability in those countries of the region. And of course, the economic crisis is driving up that movement of people. But we're not seeing the large numbers of Iranians cross the borders at this stage. And what we're understanding from the local authorities is that local communities are responding and taking people into their homes. But that's a situation we're watching very closely.
And of course, what about potential spillover of refugees coming to Europe, potentially? Even though you're not seeing that now yet?
I think we will. I think we will, because this crisis can't be put neatly back into a box. You know, wars don't just end at frontiers, and actions have consequences. And we're in a period globally right now of kind of reckless adventurism in so many places. And of course, civilians will be displaced by that. Civilians will also be displaced by the next wave over the coming years of climate change. For every degree of climate increase, temperature increase, 1 billion people will be on the move from areas that we've lived in for millennia.
And just on that point of people on the move, we've seen thousands internally displaced in Lebanon. What is the situation like there?
Really grim. And my boss, the Secretary General, was in Lebanon at the end of last week. And I spent all weekend on the phone to our humanitarian team there. We were trying to get a convoy of support down to the south of Lebanon, which is taking a real smashing up at the moment. And we had to turn back because of the danger levels. We lost a colleague in Lebanon last week as well. So it's getting more and more dangerous for us to operate, and the needs are going up. We've got tens of thousands displaced, many of them people who were displaced already by previous conflicts.
Do you fear that Lebanon could be the next Gaza?
I do fear that. And in fact, I fear that because that's what we're hearing from some Israeli ministers right now who are speaking in increasingly belligerent language about what they plan to do to Lebanon. It's a country I know well. I was ambassador there for 4 years. It's an extraordinary country. One really interesting development in the last couple of weeks is that for the first time, the Lebanese government themselves are calling for direct negotiations with Israel, which hasn't happened in the past. And so there's potential here to reset the relationship in the region. But the path to that is through dialogue and diplomacy and not through more brutal violence.
And just a final reflection, perhaps. Do you have any hope for the Middle East?
I'm an optimist about humans. I think we have these two competing instincts, one to fight for resource, and we're doing a lot of that right now, and those people are shouting pretty loudly, but another more important one, which is to work together as communities for that resource. And I believe ultimately that is the more powerful instinct that we have. And as long as I believe that, then I'll have hope.
The UN's Humanitarian Affairs Chief Tom Fletcher speaking to Maeve McMahon there. Moving on now, as we heard earlier from Shauna, President Donald Trump's demand for global allies to help him unblock the Strait of Hormuz has been met with resistance. The EU has also rejected the prospect of expanding the mandate of its naval mission Aspides to the strait. Jakub Janis takes a closer look at why.
Donald Trump is demanding European allies step up in the Strait of Hormuz. And if they refuse, he warns NATO faces a very bad future.
Do you have any minesweepers? Well, would rather not get involved, sir. I said, for 40 years we're protecting you and you don't want to get involved in something that is very minor?
And the EU is pushing back. Let's investigate. EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas was eyeing a shift in the bloc's naval mandate for the Aspides operation. But after meeting the EU's 27 foreign ministers, her message was blunt. There is simply no appetite among member states to join the war. Quick recap. Aspides was originally launched in February 2024. It is a purely defense EU naval mission in the Red Sea, with a primary goal of protecting commercial ships from Iran-aligned Houthi drone and missile attacks. So the EU as a bloc is hitting the brakes. But it doesn't mean individual member states are walking away. Looking ahead, French President Emmanuel Macron wants to lead a fully defensive mission to reopen it once the war cools down, while Italy strongly supports expanding the defensive Aspides patrol. But Trump wants more than that, demanding the bloc secures its own energy supply. But here is a thought. Perhaps Europe's involvement should be treated as a trading card. Finnish Foreign Minister Elina Valtonen hints Europe and Ukraine now hold strong leverage. Ukraine has 4 years of expertise intercepting the exact Iranian Shahed drones that are causing chaos in the Gulf. And as the EU's naval mission, Aspides, literally translates to shields in Greek, perhaps this leverage is exactly the shield Europe needs against Trump's games.
Moving on now, a dispute between Hungary and Ukraine over disruption to the flow of Russian oil via the Druzhba pipeline continues. The pipeline was damaged in Ukraine in late January in what Kyiv said was a Russian drone attack. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has blamed Ukraine, saying he will block the approval of a €90 billion loan to the war-torn country until the pipeline is repaired and Russian crude is flowing again. EU leaders will attempt to convince Orbán to drop his veto when they gather for a summit here in Brussels tomorrow. Now, for the latest on this very fast-moving story, I must say I'm joined by our Ukraine correspondent, Sasha Vakulina. Good morning, Sasha. So we're now hearing the Commission here in Brussels saying that Kyiv has accepted its request to send European inspectors to examine the damage on this pipeline. How soon can we expect this to happen?
I think we should expect it as soon as possible. This is clearly something that Brussels and Ukraine would want to see, given that the timeline of unblocking that loan is rather urgent for Kyiv. Now, according to some Euronews sources, some of the inspectors might already be on the ground in Ukraine. I have to say this is the information that the office of Zelensky has not confirmed when asked about it. But in a joint statement, the president of the European Council and the president of the European Commission said the EU has offered Ukraine technical support and funding. This is key here, Merit. The Ukrainians have welcomed and accepted this offer. European experts are available immediately. Now, Volodymyr Zelensky did not hide previously the fact that he does not see this as a right thing. He says that this is still Russian oil, which is still financing Moscow's war against Ukraine, now currently in its 5th year. But he did say that the repair work is currently ongoing. Preliminary technical assessment indicate that the damaged oil tank cannot be restored. Ukraine is therefore considering constructing underground storage infrastructure as a longer-term and more sustainable solution. Now, underground storage would, of course, then better protect any infrastructure from any Russian attack. He also said that despite repeated massive strikes targeting oil pipeline infrastructure, Ukraine remains capable to offer alternative routes for the transit of non-Russian crude oil to the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. Now, this is the option that, of course, both Hungary and Slovakia have repeatedly rejected.
Of course, and as you say, some movement then. But again, there is really no way forward clearly before tomorrow on this loan that Orban says he will still continue to veto until Russian crude is flowing again. And clearly that's not going to happen anytime soon.
Well, that's certainly not going to happen tomorrow, as the summit will be here and will be taking place here in Brussels. Now, according to Ukraine, it will still take some time. And this is the tricky part. Orban said the loan might be unblocked, but not so fast. And that's the critical point here.
Okay, Sasha.
Last week, the Ukrainians refused to receive our experts, even though we sent them there. It seems to me that they are using the entire oil blockade to intervene in the Hungarian elections in support of the TISA party. That is why the situation is extremely simple. If there is no oil, there is no money.
In terms of the timeline, now Ukraine expects the repairment works to be over somewhere by the end of April, which is, of course, way past tomorrow's summit and also post Hungarian elections on the 12th of April.
Yes, indeed, Sasha. We will be back, I'm sure, tomorrow with more on that story. Thank you so much for joining us again this morning. Now, the Euronews Health Summit took place in Brussels yesterday. Health may no longer be at the top of the EU political agenda, but the EU's health chief, Oliver Varhelyi, said yesterday that healthcare systems in Europe are facing multiple pressing challenges and shouldn't be taken for granted. Let's take a listen.
We must face the reality, therefore, that the system is under pressure, and we just cannot take it for granted that it will stay with us tomorrow as well. Our population is aging and facing continuously growing burden of chronic diseases. There are less and less people financing our healthcare system, while we need to provide for more and more patients. Moreover, our healthcare system is facing a competitiveness challenge, both in the field of innovation capacities and safe supply of medicines and medical devices.
Also at the Health Summit, members of the European Parliament, Tilly Metz of the Greens and Sten Boss of the Liberal Renew Europe group had a heated live discussion over who should pay for health and pharma research in Europe. Should it be the patients, the taxpayers or the pharma companies? Let's listen to what the MEPs had to say.
There's a lot of public funding indeed going in research, but there's also the patient that is paying. So you could even say that the patient right now is paying twice. He's paying first with taxes, which go then to funds, and then he pays again a price at the pharmacy. So what we need for sure is at the EU level, but also at national level, more public investment. Yeah.
If we say to ourselves that there's an 80% difference between the countries of the accessibility to medicines, of course that cannot be so. So we have a huge issue at our hands to level this out between countries and to protect our universal health care. But that is only protected if we have earnings. Earnings makes taxes. Taxes makes the money to actually finance health care.
And you can catch more of that debate on the latest episode of The Ring, Euronews' weekly debate show. But that brings this edition of Europe Today to an end. Thank you for tuning in. We'll be back tomorrow morning. We'll also have a special live broadcast for you tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. Brussels time as the EU's 27 leaders gather here for a summit with that 90 billion loan for Ukraine hanging in the balance. Make sure you don't miss it. Thanks again for watching Europe Today here on Euronews, and see you soon.